Hello and welcome to the final section of Volume 1. In this section, we're going to be talking about a very popular topic for newcomers, and that's user authentication. I'm really excited to teach user authentication because of how easy it is. In the past with other frameworks, we usually have to wait longer to start teaching user authentication because user authentication can get very complicated. But with Laravel, this is actually quite easy because so much about user authentication actually comes out of the box. So we're going to be able to get up and running with user authentication with almost no work. Laravel does all the hard work for us. And that's what we'll be talking about throughout this section, is getting up and running with authentication. Now, we're going to start off here by actually setting up the authentication, and we'll be doing that in this video. This comes through a basic scaffolding script that allows us to implement authentication once again with just a simple script. No really heavy hard work on our part. It's going to get us up and running right from the get-go, and then we can kind of customize it to our needs from there. In the next video, we'll talk about forgot my password functionality, how we can set up password reset if a user forgot their password or something like that. And that actually implements with sending a user an email and all sorts of great stuff like that as well. And so it comes out of the box with Laravel. Laravel provides that functionality. We don't need to do it ourselves. After that, we're going to talk about ownership. And this basically takes and combines the concepts of authentication with and with relationships like we talked about in the previous videos. So we can define that an answer was written and belongs to a certain user, and we can do the same thing for questions. So we'll talk about that ownership and we'll define that here in that video. And then finally, we'll finish off this section with user profiles, and we'll create a user profile where we generate and display all of the answers that user has submitted and all of the questions that they've asked as well. And you can kind of see that on one user profile like page. So that's what we'll be focusing on throughout this series. This first video that we'll be starting right now is talking about setting up authentication. In this video, we'll learn how to run the scaffolding script so that we can generate everything necessary in order to set up authentication. Again, you'll be super surprised at how easy this is to get up and running with. Next, we'll run the migrations we kind of messed with in the beginning of this series, and we'll run those migrations now to go ahead and generate the user tables and the password reset tables so that we can start using authentication right away. After that, we'll start exploring files that Laravel creates for authentication. I'll show you what they are, what they do, and why they're important. And then we'll go through and actually register and log in as a user so you can see it in action. So to go ahead and get started with this, let's dive into the code, or actually let's go into the terminal so we can run that scaffolding script and then see what it generates and get up and running with this authentication, which is super, super easy. Okay, so now that we're inside of our terminal, we're going to go ahead and run that scaffolding script. And this comes with Laravel. If you're inside of a Laravel project, you're going to be able to run this right away. We're going to run php artisan make :auth. And this is all it takes to run the scaffolding for authentication. So there we go, one click and it's done. Now let's go to the code base. Let's go to our text editor and see what it's created. So now here we are inside of our text editor. You can see the files it created. Green files are brand new. Yellow files, orange files are modified or changed. So inside of our controllers folder, we do have a new controller called home controller. Home controller is not super important. It's not needed for authentication. Laravel just generates the home controller to show you how you would work with a controller that needs to be protected with authentication. So what we can see here, we'll be working on this here in a moment, is we use something called middleware. And middleware is how we protect our controllers and our routes from unauthorized eyes. So we have this concept called middleware that sits between the router and the controller. It runs kind of after the router has defined where it needs to send the user, what part of the controller to go to. But before the controller actually runs its code, the middleware sits in the middle and basically runs whatever we want it to run. And this is a perfect scenario for authentication. So there is authentication middleware. It's what we call the auth middleware, as you see here, that can run. This will basically check to see the user is logged in. If the user is logged in, it will let them continue on so that we can go to the controller and run whatever we need to do at the controller level, whatever the user expected to do with the route that they were trying to visit. But if the user is not logged in, then we would redirect them to the login page so they don't have access to that route or that URL, but instead we require them to log in. And that's the purpose of middleware. Now you can see here how easy it is to set up middleware. inside of this home controller, we're basically saying that this entire home controller, which right now is just one function, the index function, but we're basically saying using the construct method here, which runs whenever we instantiate this object. So basically, whenever we try to access any of these methods, we're requiring that everything is protected by the authentication middleware. So only authenticated users have access to this index page. And it's this easy to do. So we can actually add this now to any of our other controllers to protect the controllers and the routes inside of that controller so that only logged in users have access to it. It's a really, really good way to do it. So this home controller is just really an example. We're going to view it here because it makes a great learning opportunity. Well, eventually we'll get rid of it and we'll replace it with our own application. So that's all that we have here inside the app folder. If we take a look at the routes file next, you can see we've modified the web.php routes. We basically have this auth routes line, and then we have route get home. So the home obviously goes to that home controller. It just makes that home controller work, which is the example that Laravel creates for us. But everything else is wrapped inside of this auth routes line. So to see what this does, let's actually go to the terminal and take a look at it by running php artisan route list. Okay, so if we go ahead and run the route list, you can see we have the routes that we expect, the ones that we remember, like all of these. And then we also have, here's all of our questions one. But here in the middle, we've got a bunch that we may not recognize. We've got some password reset ones for password/email, password/reset, and so forth. These are URLs to allow us to reset our password. We'll talk about this in the next video when we focus on the forgot my password functionality. We also have a logout form, which is a post request that allows us to log the user out. We have a couple for login here, a get request and a post request. Allows us to log a user in and to either show a form or when we submit the form to actually run the login method. And then we've got our home page, which we're familiar with. And then down here at the bottom, we've got register routes. And these allow us to basically show the form that we want to register a new user. And then when we post to that form, we want to actually register the user, add them to the database, and all that kind of stuff. So that's what we've done here. We've gone ahead and we have all of those routes with that auth routes method inside of our routes file. Now, before we move on, I do want to take some attention now that you understand what middleware is. I want to kind of point your attention now to this other column that we have over here, and it's the middleware column. We're starting to see some interesting things in this. Before it just said web down the left, but now we're seeing that there's some other middleware that's available to us. So the web middleware is basically middleware that provides lots of functionality that all of our web-based routes need. These are routes that you would generally view inside of a browser. Every route that we create in our web.php file inside the routes folder will have the web middleware. So this provides things like CSRF protection. It cleans and sanitizes our form data and just some basic stuff like that that we need when we're visiting URLs on the web. So that all comes by default. So we can kind of ignore the web right now. Just know that that's kind of what is included in the web middleware. So all of that basically happens before it hits the controller, thanks to the web middleware. But we have a couple other middlewares here. We have the auth middleware. We know what that does. That protects a route so that only logged in users have access to that route. And you can see here, for example, the home controller has the auth middleware defined. So only logged in users have access to the home controller. Then we have a couple other routes that have this guest middleware. And the guest is exactly the opposite of the auth middleware. It requires that only logged out users can view this page. You might wonder why you want to only allow a logged out user to view a page, and that's for pages like this, like the login form. So the login form, if a user's already logged in, you don't want them to log in again. You don't want to show them that form, allow them to submit a form to log in again. So instead, we require that they're a guest. We only let logged out people see the login form. It doesn't make sense to let logged in users log in again, so we only let the logged out users do that. And that's what this guest middleware does. We see the same thing with password resets. We only want password resets to be done by logged out users, so that's what we require here. Same with register. If we don't want a user that's logged in to register while they're logged in, so we just have that middleware there. So that's middleware and the routes that are created. Let's go back to our code and take a look at what's left. So those are the basic files there. So this is actually going to go ahead and wrap up part number 1. Now that we've gone ahead and we've seen kind of the introduction of how authentication works and we've ran the authentication scaffolding.